Hi everybody, welcome to another episode of That's Philosophy with Matthew Weflen, that's me. Today I thought we could look at Plato's Apology. A lot of you are probably being assigned this dialogue by Plato in your intro to philosophy classes or in your humanities classes perhaps. And I thought what I'd like to do in the next 30 minutes or so is give you an introduction to it and a walkthrough of the text so that you can come away really understanding it. First things first, who is the author? Well, there's Plato, you see. He's writing everything, but he's not the star, he's not the subject. The subject is a man called Socrates. Who is Socrates? Well, he was famous in the city of Athens. He was born around 470 BC, and he was, spoiler alert, executed in 399 BC, so he lived to be about 70 years old. And he had inspired many young men in the city, usually the sons of the wealthy, to follow him around and to engage in conversations with people. He was accused of being a teacher. He said he was not. He said that he just allowed people to follow him and listen to his conversations. His mission, he said, was to find out about things, to see what people know, what things are really true and really real. So the setting, the time and the place is 399 BC. Socrates has been accused by some ambitious politicians of crimes for which the penalty could be death. You can see here, I've laid out the main charges. The first one is corrupting the youth, and the second is not believing in the gods of the city. Sort of a corollary charge is teaching the same thing to others. But of course, he's teaching these things. Why would these things be capital offenses? In addition to Athens just being a different place with different customs and different laws, you have to understand that just 4 or 5 years prior to this trial, Athens had been taken over. Their democracy, which was featured an assembly of citizens who would vote up and down on every issue, straight majority rule, a very direct form of democracy. Their democracy was overthrown. It was overthrown by a dictatorship, one that was financed by the Persians, but that was run by local Athenians who were ambitious. And some of those Athenians were young men, now slightly older men, who had followed Socrates during his conversations. And so in this period of recovery of the democracy, you can imagine that people wanted to point fingers. They wanted heads to roll, and they wanted to figure out whom they could blame for Athens' great fall in prestige and power. And so Socrates was viewed as someone who would be a ripe target for that sort of thing. And the person who would bring those charges would be, sort of lifted in the estimation of his peers because, he's rooted out this evil. So was Socrates this great evil? Was he a corrupting influence on the young people of Athens? Well, of course, he says no. His apology is a record of his speech at his trial. Okay, now is it an apology? What does apology mean? We hear the word apology and we think, oh, he's going to say he's sorry for things. Well, I think you'll find as you read that he's not sorry. The word comes from Greek roots, naturally, and it's apo and logos, or logia, and the idea is that logos is a speech or a discussion of something, and apo is the prefix that means around or about. So really this isn't Socrates apologizing in our sense of the word for his behavior, but instead explaining himself, not seeking any apology, and perhaps not even seeking acquittal. So, how does he start his speech? You should take a look in your book. I'm going to refer to what are called Stephanus numbers. If you have your book with you, you'll see along the sides there are numbers with letters, okay? Now these are called Stephanus numbers, and they're universal to every Plato textbook that's worth a damn. You should use them to refer to places in your translations, whatever your translation is, and you should use them to write your papers. So the apology here starts at 17a, and at 17a, Socrates begins by saying, I don't speak in fancy ways like my accusers do. I speak in unadorned phrases that just tumble out of my mouth as if they were the truth, which is what they are. Now, is he being serious? Good question. Socrates is someone who's been having conversations for the better part of 70 years. He's probably pretty good at debate and argument. However, I do think he's probably being honest with respect to his belief that he is telling the unadorned, unvarnished truth. So at 18b, you'll see he says, "It's right for me, gentlemen, to defend myself against the first lying accusations against me and the first accusers." So what he's referring to here is his reputation. Socrates has been doing his business for, let's say 40 or 50 years, ever since he became an adult. How strange is this, first of all? He has a reputation, and his reputation is as a weirdo, a strange guy. The typical expectation for a man in Athens in the 4th and 5th centuries BC would be to be a businessman, to run the family business that he inherits from his father, to be profitable, to be productive in the community, to go and perform ritual sacrifices and go to festivals, basically to observe the religious duties of an Athenian of that time, and to participate in the democracy, okay? So did Socrates do those things? Not really. He inherited probably a business from his father of masonry, possibly sculpting. It depends on which source you look at. And he didn't really do it. He didn't maintain it. He didn't build it up, and he wasn't terribly productive as commerce goes. Instead, he liked to hang around the marketplace, the agora, as it was called, and talk to people. So just right there, that's a very weird sort of role to be inhabiting in this society. He has a reputation. Now, the particular reputation that he's going to address, and it's at 18d, he says, "What's absurd in all this is that one cannot even know or mention their names unless one of them is a writer of comedies." Okay, the theater was a big part of Athenian Greek culture, and there was a playwright named Aristophanes who had won or come close to winning prizes in comedy during the theater festivals, and he had written one play called Clouds, which was about a young man who was the son of an older man who was foolish and impulsive and headstrong and wanted to just race horses and have fun. But his father was worried about all the debts that his son was accruing and thought that his son instead should learn how to debate and to win in law courts if his debts ever came due. And so his father sends, or at least tries to send his son, to Socrates. Socrates is a character in this play. And in the play, the character Socrates is a teacher. He runs a place called the Thinkatorium. And at the Thinkatorium, the students either debate silly things like how far a flea can propel itself with its own flatulence, or how to make weak arguments defeat strong ones. You can imagine the sort of reputation that this might earn for a person. If you are renowned to be basically a liar who can teach the skill of lying and the skill of tricking people to others, you might imagine that you would have a reputation as being a corrupting influence on the youth. Aristophanes was talking about themes which were a big deal in Athenian life. The struggle between the younger generation and the older generation. The older generation had won wars against Persia and secured for Athens great power and great financial success in the Mediterranean region. And so their sons had never known the sort of struggle that the parents did. They were kind of a baby boom, let's say, to draw a parallel to United States history. And perhaps like our baby boomers, the boomers in Athens thought they knew a lot, but maybe kind of didn't, and didn't have the foundations in character and the foundations in education and the foundations in tradition that the older generation thought were keys to being successful. So I want to tell you that just to set the stage for you, to indicate why someone like Socrates might be viewed as a very negative influence on the young men who are becoming powerful in Athens. So when he sets about to address these accusations, he tells a story. And you should look in your text at 20d. He says, "What has caused my reputation is none other than a certain kind of wisdom. What kind of wisdom? Human wisdom, perhaps. It may be that I really possess this, while those whom I mentioned just now are wise with a wisdom more than human." Who did he just mention? He mentioned men called Sophists. Sophists were traveling teachers. That was their job. They would go and they would collect a fee and instruct young men in how to be good debaters, good speakers, but also good household managers, good businessmen, how to be healthy, wealthy, and wise, essentially. Socrates has said, you know what, I'm not one of those guys. You might think I'm one of those guys because I go around talking to people, but I never collect a fee, and I don't claim to teach anybody anything. I just have conversations for my own benefit, and people might be witnesses to those conversations. So at 20d, he begins a story about the Oracle at Delphi, which is intended, I guess, to indicate why people think he's so wise, and why he might have this reputation that's actually undeserved. He mentions his friend Chaerephon. Chaerephon went to the Oracle at Delphi. Now, what's an oracle? An oracle is a sort of religious shrine. Delphi was an island city in the Mediterranean that many, many Greek city-states sent missionaries to, and they would go and they would ask the oracle for advice on any number of things. And there was a group of priestesses who would sort of put their heads over this crack in the earth and inhale this noxious fume and go into a sort of trance and deliver an oracular prophecy or pronouncement. And so Socrates says, my friend Chaerephon went to the oracle and asked if there was any man wiser than Socrates. And the priestess replied that no one was wiser. Now, Socrates is telling this story to the jury that's going to be deciding whether he's been corrupting the youth and whether he does or does not believe in the gods of the city. I can imagine a lawyer today telling Socrates to shut his mouth. Perhaps it's not the most effective strategy to appeal to the jury by saying that the Oracle at Delphi has declared me the wisest person alive. You might imagine that that might insult people or make them think that you were full of yourself or haughty or arrogant. You know, we can't get into Socrates' head, not completely anyway. Why would he tell the jury something like this? I mean, maybe it really happened. Maybe his friend did go. This does purport to be a relatively direct record of what Socrates said, and as far as the scholarship goes, most scholars think it was published not too long after Socrates' execution. So there were any number of people who could dispute what was said here. So it probably is pretty accurate. Well, Chaerephon went to the oracle, and the oracle proclaimed that, yes, indeed, Socrates is wisest. And so Socrates now has to think about why the oracle would say something like that. I don't think I'm wise at all, says Socrates. But if I think about it, what I did after I heard that was I started conversing with people, and I started seeking out people who I thought were wise. So he goes to 3 groups of people. So if you look in the text, you should look at 21D or so. He says, I thought that this particular man was wiser than I, but you said I was. Then when I examined this man, there is no need for me to tell you his name. He was one of our public men. My experience was something like this. I thought that he appeared wise to many people, and especially to himself, but he was not. I then tried to show him that he thought himself wise, but that he was not. As a result, he came to dislike me, and so did many of the bystanders. So I withdrew and thought to myself, I am wiser than this man. It is likely that neither of us knows anything worthwhile. But he thinks he knows something when he does not. Whereas when I do not know, neither do I think I know. So I am likely to be wiser than he is to this small extent, that I do not think I know what I do not know. Okay, so the story goes that the first person or group of people that Socrates talked to after the oracle was public men. So that would be politicians. And politicians, I think, still today, often think themselves the wisest of all. They know everything. They know how everything works. They have all the best words, all the best information. They know more than the generals. They know more than the scientists. I hope that sounds familiar. Socrates says, you know what? We're probably both ignorant. We probably both lack wisdom. But I don't think I have it. He thinks he has it. And so in that way, I guess I am wiser. This is what's called Socratic ignorance. It's the idea that it's better to not claim knowledge than to claim knowledge. Because if you don't claim knowledge, you can't be wrong. If you claim knowledge, you open yourself up to being mistaken. He then proceeds to talk to 2 more groups of people. He talks to the merchants and he talks to poets. And he engages them in discussion over the things they think they know. And he does find that merchants and craftsmen have knowledge that he doesn't, but they often think that because of that knowledge, they have other knowledge outside of that knowledge too. And I'm sure you can think of people like that. Poets as well. Think about businessmen in our culture, and think about celebrities and artists and actors, let's say, in our culture. Often it does seem that people who have success in one area think that because they're succeeding in that area, that means they must have knowledge that spans everything. And often we find that, again, they do not. Being a successful businessman does not qualify you to talk about global warming or evolution or science or any number of topics under the sun, and neither does being a Hollywood actor qualify you to cure the ills of the world or to make pronouncements about everything. So Socrates is saying, look, I've got this reputation, but really it's mistaken. I'm not wise, except in that I don't think I know what I don't know. You may have gone to the play by Aristophanes and seen Socrates. Well, that Socrates is just a caricature. That Socrates is just, this silly person who's modeled after any of the Sophists or any of the philosophers that you might find. They just happen to put my name to it. And then my behavior might make people think that I know things when I prove that someone else doesn't know something, but that's all I was doing, was proving that someone else doesn't know something. So you can't judge me, says Socrates, based on the sort of reputation that's built up over the last few decades about me. It's mistaken. It's erroneous. After that portion of his speech, Socrates proceeds to address the current accusations against him. So this starts at about 24b, okay? And here he takes up discussion with Meletus, who is one of his accusers, one of the ambitious young men, and he engages Meletus in sort of a back and forth debate about corrupting the youth. And he says, look, Meletus, you say that I'm the person who corrupts the youth? And Meletus says, yes, you are. And Socrates creates an analogy. And he says, well, what about horse trainers? Is it the way of things that the many corrupt their horses by training them poorly? Or is it that the few, the individuals who are horse trainers by trade, corrupt the horses? And what Socrates is trying to draw out with this analogy is to say, you say that all of the people here and all of the counselors and all of the orators and all of the fathers in this audience benefit the youth, and that I alone corrupt them. Is that the way things usually are? When it comes to horses, usually it's the people with expertise that benefit horses, and it's the many who have sort of bad habits and bad training methods that corrupt their horses. Now, is this a very effective way of refuting the charge? No, Socrates isn't really directly addressing what he does or doesn't do. He's just sort of drawing an analogy. But what he's trying to do, and you'll see this at 26b, is to say that Meletus hasn't really thought through his charges very well and doesn't really understand who corrupts whom, nor does he understand how great masses of people are benefited. And so just before 26b at 26a, Socrates says, look, either I don't corrupt the young, because that would be fitting with this analogy, or if I do, it's unwillingly. Okay? And so you either should have found me and taken me aside and tried to convince me of better training methods, or you should have told me to cease and desist. The next charge he addresses is of not believing in the same gods that the city believes. And so this starts at 26c. He says, actually, you should take a look at 26b. And so, men of Athens, you say I corrupt the young. It is obvious from your deposition that it is by teaching them to not believe in the gods in whom the city believes, but in other new spiritual things. Is this not what you say that I teach, and so corrupt them? That is most certainly what I do say, says Meletus. Then by whom these very gods we are talking about, Meletus, make this clear to me and to these men. I cannot be sure whether you mean that I teach the belief that there are some gods, and therefore myself believe that there are gods, and am not altogether an atheist, nor am I guilty of that, not, however, the gods in whom the city believes, or whether you mean that I do not believe in gods at all, and that this is what I teach to others. Okay, Socrates is again addressing the charge in an interesting way here. He's not really refuting the charge of not believing in the gods in whom the city believes, but he's setting a sort of rhetorical trap for Meletus. He's saying, wait, are you saying that I believe in slightly different gods and teach that, or that I believe in no gods and don't teach that? And Meletus falls for it, and he says, no, you believe in no gods, and you teach that. Okay? And so Socrates then proceeds to talk about his reputation and various other charges that were made. And he says, now wait a minute. You say that I believe in a spiritual sign. So this was another part of Socrates' reputation. Let's talk about that. Something that Socrates was reputed to have suffered from, let's say, is that he had a spirit called a daimon that spoke to him. So Socrates would be, walking around, talking to people, going to a party, whatever, and occasionally he would just stop and look up to the heavens and be lost in thought, sometimes for minutes or even hours, and then would sort of snap out of it and go back about what he was doing, which you can imagine would be a very strange thing to witness if you were not Socrates. And Socrates said that his daimon was speaking to him. A daimon is like a spirit. And the daimon would never tell him what to do or what to believe, but would instead dissuade him from believing something or doing something. The daimon would basically always say, don't do that, don't say that, don't go there. And this was something that he was famous for. And so Socrates sort of throws this back in Meletus's face. Meletus, who has agreed that Socrates is altogether an atheist, okay? And he says, now wait, you say I'm an atheist, but I'm also famous for having this spirit that speaks to me. Isn't a spirit like a god? So don't I believe in some gods? And Meletus has to agree that a spirit is like a god, and therefore his previous statement is erroneous. So has Socrates refuted the charge of not believing in the gods that the city believes in? No. What he's done is he's made Meletus look foolish, okay? And again, I can imagine a lawyer advising Socrates not to engage in this sort of conversation, not to, try to make people look foolish, because it could end up rebounding on him and making him look bad or arrogant or haughty. And, well, again, this is the way Socrates does things. And it's consistent with the way Socrates engages in conversation throughout his life. He asks someone about something they think they know, and then he points out inconsistencies and sort of destroys the piece of knowledge that they think they know. Maybe they then replace it with something new. Maybe they don't. Some dialogues with Socrates proceed the one way, some dialogues proceed the other way. So is Socrates trying to actually achieve an innocent verdict here? Maybe not. Maybe what he's trying to do is to demonstrate to a wide audience what he's been doing for the past 50 years of his life. The kind of debate and sort of dialectic that he engages in with people, this sort of thesis, antithesis, destruction, replacing with a new thesis. Maybe that's what he's trying to do. He doesn't seem to be trying to be declared innocent. All right. So he talks about his daimon. If you want to find that, you can find that at 31c. And you can see at 35d that the jury now gives its verdict of guilty, and Meletus asks for the penalty of death. So in an Athenian trial, you would have the speech of the accuser. Now, we don't have that, okay? Plato did not write that down. Then we have the speech of the accused. We do have that. That's what we've just been reading and listening to. Then there is the verdict, okay? And in this case, the verdict is guilty, all right? So what happens now is the prosecutor gives a speech asking for a particular penalty, and the guilty party offers a counter-proposal for a penalty. So Meletus is asked for the death penalty, and it's up to Socrates to propose an alternative. And if you look at 36b, this big paragraph, he says, I believe in justice, and I think that a person should get their just deserts. They should be treated in the way that they treated others. And when I think about myself, all I've been doing is benefiting the city. And so how should someone who benefits the city be treated? He should be given free meals for life at a place called the Prytaneum, which is kind of like a public hall. And typically at the Prytaneum, Olympic victors would be celebrated, and there would be parties thrown in their honor, and they would be given free meals. And so Socrates says, well, that's like me. I benefit the city more than an Olympic victor does. So if we think about our culture today, you can imagine someone like, Michael Jordan or LeBron James, if that's what you're into, being celebrated, right? Because they brought championships home to their city, right? And, someone says, I'll buy you a drink, or let's have a parade or a party in your honor. And Socrates says, that's like me. I've been benefiting the city. But more so than the athlete makes you think that you're happy. But I, who point out your ignorance and try to turn you towards goodness and virtue, I actually make you happy. And so if anybody should be celebrated, it should be me. Okay, now remember, this is Socrates proposing his counter penalty after being declared guilty by the jury of corrupting the youth and not believing in the gods of the city. I think you can imagine the reaction that this might have gotten. He must have been hearing it in the crowd, and so he does propose a second penalty, which is, a fine. And his friends, Plato, Crito, Critobulus, Apollodorus, they bid him to put the fine at 30 minas, which is a significant chunk of change, let's say about $10,000. And they will stand surety for the money. So he grudgingly, after suggesting free meals for life, suggests a fine that his friends will pay for him. Is this the way to appeal to the jury and to avoid a death sentence? Well, we can see the jury votes again and sentences Socrates to death. And we have records, and the records indicate that more people voted for the death penalty than voted for guilt. So his speech went over kind of like a lead balloon, it sounds like. He upset people enough to make more of them want his death than wanted him to be convicted in the first place. And so Socrates then enters the sort of last portion of his speech, which is prophesying for the future. And he says, I'm looking at 39a here. He says, I've lived my life a certain way, and I've never tried to avoid danger or death, and I wouldn't do that today, even though I was in danger of being given the death penalty. He says, and this is at 39a again, right at the beginning of 39a to b. He says, it's not difficult to avoid death, gentlemen. It is much more difficult to avoid wickedness, for it runs faster than death. He's slow and elderly, and he's been caught by the slower pursuer, death. But his accusers, who are clever and sharp and young, they've been caught by the quicker wickedness. So I really like that phrasing. The other famous phrase that Socrates offers through Plato here, because of course Plato is the one who is writing, is that the unexamined life is not worth living. what he's doing, and that's at 38a, he says, perhaps some might say, but Socrates, if you leave us, will you not be able to live quietly without talking? Now this is the most difficult point on which to convince some of you. If I say that it's impossible for me to keep quiet because that means disobeying the god, you will not believe me and think I'm being ironic. On the other hand, if I say that it is the greatest good for a man to discuss virtue every day, and those other things about which you hear me conversing and testing myself and others, for the unexamined life is not worth living for men, you will believe me even less. So, in his final statement after being convicted and sentenced to death, Socrates, I think, offers kind of a justification for his life. And the justification is that it's not worth being a human being if you don't go through your day, your month, your year, your life without questioning and examining and debating and thinking about what's true and what's really real. Of course, we can all sort of sleepwalk through our lives. Back then, maybe it was focusing on comedies and tragedies, drinking, exercise, sport, commerce, and of course those things are things that we still value today, but we all today also have the internet, smartphones, social media, things that we can distract ourselves with. Is that really a life that's worth living for people? Socrates says, no, it's not. The life that's worth living is the examined life, the life in which you consistently question your own beliefs and you engage in sort of debate with the people around you to question their beliefs too, to try to figure out who knows anything, if anyone knows anything. And then let's couple that with the other statement that I mentioned about wickedness running faster than death. Socrates, his life's mission has been to engage people in this sort of debate and to try to turn himself and to turn others toward the good, toward good behavior, honest behavior, virtuous and ethical behavior. That's his life's mission. And so he's not willing to stop. He's not willing to silence himself, even if it will get him acquitted. He says, wickedness runs faster than death. I'm not going to run away from death because I would rather run away from wickedness. And so, hey, you might have to execute me. I'm an old man anyway. No big deal, right? But you're not going to make me change. You're not going to make me turn around and turn away from virtue and from knowledge and from truth. I don't know how many of us would say the same thing given the same circumstances. I've got kids. I think if I were being accused of believing something or of engaging in a certain lifestyle and the penalty being proposed was death, I might say, okay, hey, I'll renounce anything you want me to renounce. I'll change anything you want me to change. Just don't kill me. I want to be there for my kids. Socrates had kids and yet didn't feel the same way. There are people in human history who have stood out for their willingness to risk death and to stand for a particular belief system, and those people are often, probably rightfully, revered by our culture. People like Socrates, people like Jesus of Nazareth, people like the Buddha, people like Gandhi, people like Martin Luther King Jr., these exceptional martyrs for ideas, right? Socrates definitely stands out as one of them, and we're still talking about him 2,500 years later. So, to summarize here, the apology, I think, is being assigned to you and to other students because it's relatively brief. And it's a pretty strong document of that kind of stand, that kind of belief, that risking death is worth the danger to stand for this kind of lifestyle, this examined lifestyle. Socrates was killed not terribly long after. He did not escape prison. He refused to escape, even though his friends tried to convince him to, because he thought it was wrong. And he thought it was not just to have two wrongs instead of just one. Of course, it's wrong to execute him. He thinks he's innocent, but it wouldn't be right to do something wrong in response to that wrong. And again, I wonder how many of us would act the same way in the same situation. You know, I hope that students, when they come away from this, think about themselves, they think about their own lives, they think about what they would stand for if push came to shove, if their life was on the line. Another question you can ask yourself is, should we be like Socrates? The answer might not be yes. If everyone were like Socrates, if everyone neglected their business and went around having conversations with people and sort of bothering people, you know, what would our society look like? You know, Socrates compares himself to a stinging fly, which rouses people out of their slumber, okay? And, you know, I think that's a worthwhile thing to have in your society. Someone who's a sort of irritant, someone who makes sure that people don't just sort of fall into lazy belief systems. But should everybody be like this? You know, probably not, right? I mean, someone's got to, you know, build the bridges and clean the sewer pipes. You know, otherwise things won't work, right? So what would you stand for? Should you be like Socrates? If you should it be all day, every day, or just sometimes, right? How much of your life should you examine? I think these are questions that anybody can ask themselves today and still find current and relevant. And I hope that you come away from the apology understanding it a little bit better, but also applying it to your own life. And I hope you don't hate your teacher or your school for having inflicted it upon you, right? I mean, it's only 20 pages or so, and I think the questions it forces you to ask yourself are interesting ones.